Hi everyone. Well, today we're going to talk about Chapter 8, Ethics and Fair Treatment in HR Management. One of the biggest issues that you have to face is when somebody says that's not fair. And if you have children, you hear that probably all the time. That's not fair. So let's talk about what's meant by ethical behavior, factors that shape ethical behavior at work, 4 ways that HR can influence ethical behavior at work, how to exercise fair disciplinary practices, and 4 important factors in managing dismissals effectively. Well, what's ethics? Ethics are the principles of conduct governing an individual or a group, and they're standards used to decide proper conduct. We all think about whether or not something is right. So we talk about ethics in that sense. What's good or bad, right or wrong, better or worse. It also involves morality, which is the society's accepted standards of behavior. So there's that we have to take into consideration. And then there are moral standards, which address matters of serious consequence to society's well-being. Notice that I'm not talking about legal. Something can be legal but not right. So the law does not guide what is ethical. And companies where fairness and justice are part of the mission are more ethical companies. So sometimes workplace unfairness can be very overt and very much in your face. And we've probably all had the misfortune of working for somebody who was a bit abusive in their power. And that makes for a very bad, contentious workplace where satisfaction with the job and even with life is not very good. So we need to think about how do we treat employees fairly. And fairness is something that is a perception based upon each employee. But if we're committed and we want employees to be satisfied with their job, then we put in place different outcomes so that we have fair processes, so that people just don't get fired because of one situation. We want to look at what that is and how we can best do that. So, what about treating employees fairly? How do we do that? Well, anytime that we have fairness, people want to be heard. They want to know what the rules are. And then if there's an exception, they want to be able to be heard and for somebody to talk to them about why or why not that is something that should be fair. I've had the opportunity over the years to have to talk about and talk with employees who had a perception of something not being fair. And typically what I would do is ask them, well, why is it that you think it's not fair? How would you go about doing that? And sometimes I've had to go back and say, well, based upon previous things, this is what we've had to do. But there are legal areas, FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act, discipline rights, personnel files being available and open, political activity being covered under free speech, whistleblower rights in case the company is not doing something, workers' comp. Those are all things which employees have legal rights. But ethical behavior, we need to talk about morals. And managers can do the right things, and employees will look at that, and then they will follow that. In the event that the manager or supervisor is not ethical, then employees aren't ethical, and they won't adhere to that level. Morality comes from within, and here in the South, we're all indoctrinated and taught from a very early age about the golden rule and about what would Jesus do. So we need to think about that. Some of the things that HR can do is we can actually reward ethical behavior, but ethical behavior should be a given. We shouldn't have to reward it. We should punish unethical behavior and make sure that people understand that that's not what we're going to put up with. And sometimes people do tend to alter how they behave based upon the environment that they're in. And we've seen that time and time again. Well, the person is the mainstay in ethics. Age does have something to do with that, and older workers typically have stricter interpretations of ethical standards. But everyone has their own ethical, moral base and boundaries. So what can we do? Well, just as if I give you a high stakes test, you're going to feel more pressure to cheat than if you have a lot of different grades. So if you only had 2 grades in this class, a midterm and a final, you would feel more pressured to cheat than if you have a lot of grades. So organizations can put a lot of pressure on employees to meet certain schedules or business objectives, and employees will then think that they need to cheat in order to get there or to do things that aren't ethical. Well, sometimes in the business world there are cover-ups, and the information as far as how well the company is doing is not given properly. And sometimes that can lead to legal issues, but definitely to ethical issues. And in some organizations, managers and corporate execs will tell people things are going great, when in essence, things are not going great. So when those things happen, it's not congruent. It's not in a line. So the boss has an extremely big area in role modeling on ethical behavior. So if the boss is ethical and exhibits ethical behavior, then misconduct at work decreases. So we look to our superiors to set the stage and to set the level. But what happens when you have a boss who isn't ethical or influences others to do things that aren't ethical? Well, that's where HR can step in, and they determine the culture, and they give feedback to superiors, to managers, to the executives, so that there are values that the corporation has. So we have to clarify expectations. We have to provide support. But one of the things that you can do is you can do a quick ethics test. Is it legal? If it's not legal, it's definitely not ethical. Is it right? How do you feel about it? Does it make you feel bad? Who will be affected? Does it fit with the company values? And if it came out in a newspaper, or if your mom or your dad found out about it, or your significant other, would they question whether or not you did the right thing? And will it reflect poorly on the organization? So some of the ways that HR can do that is in staffing and selection. You can hire more ethical people. And there are some honesty tests that you can give, and some of them have been found to be reliable and valid. But you can also do comprehensive background checks. And that's one of the things that's occurring right now in the medical field, and even with our students as they go out to clinicals, is they have to go through a background check to make sure while they're working that they're going to be ethical on the job. We can train so that we can show ethical dilemmas, and I've got some information online where you can look at that. And we can use HR to make sure that it's functioning in an ethical way, making sure that things are laid out through policies and procedures, and also in making sure that policies and procedures are followed properly. And in fact, one of the people that work with me right now, they are listening to a grievance procedure on a termination. So even at the college, we have those systems in place where if somebody feels that they haven't been treated fairly, that their peers can look at that and find out and give them some information. Well, there's a law called Sarbanes-Oxley, and it requires that the CEO and the CFO of publicly traded companies attest to the accuracy of financial statements. And the reason that came out is because there were some, Tyco, Enron come to mind, where the CEO said, well, I signed it, but I really didn't know what I was signing. That's their job to know what they're signing, so that's not a good, legitimate excuse. And then there's performance appraisal. When you do performance appraisals, you need to make sure that employees know how they're going to be appraised, and they need to be objective and fair. We need to have discipline systems that aren't harsh punishment. We need to build that two-way communication. And again, when somebody has a problem, we need to listen to them and give them the appropriate feedback. Well, discipline is not a fun thing to do, and I've had to sit through my share of disciplinary actions. Normally, as a second party, after helping the manager to prepare for that. And let me tell you, by the time we get to that discipline stage, when I've been involved, the employee knows that there's something that's going to happen because we have made it clear to them. It's not coming out of the blue. So there's 3 pillars of the discipline process as outlined in the book: clear rules and regulations, progressive penalties, and appeals process. Where I've worked before, there's always been, happens once, you coach the employee to do the right thing. If it happens again, you do an investigation, they get an oral warning. If it happens again, then you do an investigation, and it's a written warning. If they do it again, then you can either suspend the person, give decision-making leave, and then if it happens the last time, then you terminate. There are some things that are automatic termination, but that's not very typical. So there's a progressive. And then there's an appeals process where they can do a grievance and have somebody review that. Or you can go to an arbitration where an arbitrator renders a final opinion, or mediation where you come together and try to figure out where you go from there. So a mediator, it's not binding, but they help you to come to a solution. So at FedEx, they have a management review, an officer complaint, and then an executive appeals review. So what about traditional discipline? Well, it does build some resentment on the fact of the person who's being disciplined. But it does force employees to gain short-term compliance. So what about discipline without punishment? It talks about oral reminding, written reminding, decision-making leave, and then you can actually purge information out of there. But more and more, we've got email that's being given for warning student or employees. But we also need to make sure that employers understand that they can be held liable for illegal acts committed by employees via email. Well, what happens when you have to terminate somebody? Oh my goodness, terminations are never fun. Every time I've ever had to go into a termination situation, my stomach rolls, I feel uncomfortable, but you have to do it when individuals are not doing what they need to do. Because the rest of the employees are sitting around saying, getting back to that perception of fairness, Well, if they can get away with it, why can't I get away with it? So you have to discipline, and sometimes you have to terminate. You need to make sure that the termination is humane. It needs to be in private, it needs to be quick, and you need to move on. That's not a fact finding. You've done your fact finding beforehand. You know that the person has done what you are alleging that they're doing. If you have any doubts, then you don't do that. There are some termination at will. Tennessee is a right-to-work state, but you can't terminate somebody on the basis of sex, race, national origin, or religious discrimination, or age. So what are some grounds for dismissal? Unsatisfactory performance, but you really have to work at that. And then misconduct, deliberate and willful violation of employer rules. I had a situation once where I had to terminate someone who got into a fight on the job, and the person took out a box cutter, cut their jeans, and then that person then hit them. Well, I had to terminate both of them because we had a no fighting at work policy, and the individual had already been forewarned. There were some conflicts with that individual, and I told the individual, if this person does something to you, don't strike back, because otherwise I will not have an opportunity to do anything other than terminate. Well, what if somebody's not able to do the job? Well, if they're not able to do the job, let's say that you have a truck driver who all of a sudden loses his truck driver's license, then that's a termination. But if you have someone who is not capable of doing the work, then you have to look at it and see. What about insubordination? Direct disregard of bosses and refusal to obey the boss's orders. Well, that can be somewhat sticky, so you really need to think about it. But the one thing you don't want to do is when you've made a decision to terminate somebody, you don't want to end up into a lawsuit. And typically, employees will try that avenue. A lot of times they don't have anything to lose. Well, I have been sued. I've been sued personally. I've had EEOC, that's the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and the Tennessee Human Rights Commission, the THRC, file paperwork with me, and we've always been able to document why the person was terminated. Let me get the lights back on. So you've got to have your documentation, or they will win, and they will win some large sums of dollars. So you got to make sure that you're consistent with what you do, consistent with your policies and procedures, and you need to make sure that the person follows those policies and procedures. So when you get ready to terminate someone, you need to plan the interview carefully, get to the point, tell the person what's going on, listen, but you should have already done your fact-finding, review elements of any severe severance package, and then where do you go from there? You can also offer the person outplacement counseling, and sometimes you do that when a person's not terminated for cause, but because the job is not there any longer. Maybe you're downsizing or even shutting down the facility. So you may also want to do an exit interview. Not with those people you're terminating, though. With the individuals who are leaving the company because they have nothing to lose. They're already leaving. And then sometimes you have to lay off people, and we talked about that. That's not permanent. That's short term. And layoff procedures are typically made on the basis of what you're capable of doing, and then also based upon the length of service that a person has with the company. And if you have to downsize, then sometimes what happens is you have to let go 10, 15, 20% of the individuals. And sometimes you can ask for volunteers. They may be ready to retire. So there's all sorts of ways that you can do that. But again, what I want to leave you with is the fact that ethical behavior is very important. It's important in the workplace. It's important in your life. But we also need to make sure that we are, as managers and as HR people, we need to make sure that we are fair and consistent with our policies and procedures, and that we treat individuals with respect, irregardless of the fact that we may be sitting in a termination with them. I hope that you've enjoyed my lecturette on this. It ran a little bit long, but it's a very important chapter. And that's Chapter 8. Mark it off, and we'll move on to Chapter 9 next time. Thanks again. Don't forget to take your quiz and get your environmental scans in. Get your postings up there. Thanks. See you later. Bye.